Welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. I'm Jonathan Freedman, and I'm joined by our next guest, the returning guest. Always nice to see Michelle Rupp, founder and CEO of Memorable Results Media.
Hi,
Welcome
Jonathan.
back.
Thank
Good to
you.
good to see
Great.
you, Michelle. Thanks for coming back. I know today you have a topic you want to discuss, and it's kind of perhaps topical and timely. Businesses dealing with crises. We seem to be dealing with crises all over the place. So, tell us a little bit about crisis planning and what it looks like from a public relations perspective.
Absolutely. Jonathan, thank you. I was doing a little research and I don't know if this statistic will surprise you or not, but it did me that a little under half, about 46, 47% of businesses in the United States do not have a crisis plan. Now, I would have thought that that would have been a much larger number of businesses that do not have a crisis plan. And
I would agree.
perhaps their definition of a crisis plan and my definition of a crisis plan, we might be in a couple different ballparks. But I think it's interesting in particularly in an environment right now, crises are popping up every day. And where businesses, regardless of the size, can find themselves in some difficult waters if they don't have some type of framework, of plan ready to go in place so that when that crisis happens, they can spring into action and get maybe a couple of steps ahead of the story rather than playing a dramatic catch up where the story's already 2 miles down the road and now the business is trying to rush to catch up and get in front of it.
So I would bet based on your brief explanation and the statistics that you cite, sticking your head in the sand is probably not qualified as a plan. And
Right.
shutting the phones off and not answering emails is probably not the definition of a good plan. So I tend to agree with you. I'm surprised that the number is as low as it is. And maybe that's just the result of, polling and surveying where people, tell the pollsters what they want to hear as opposed to actual
True.
facts. Um,
True.
so wonderful to hear. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what are the components and what you're talking about when you talk about a good crisis plan?
Definitely. I think that there are some three main components when it comes to putting a plan together. And that first of all, the very first step I would ask businesses and what I help businesses work through is what are some of those top crises that could face your business? For example, if you are heavy on tech, your top crises may be more in a cyber attack arena versus if you're a brick and mortar and that crises may be embezzlement, workplace violence, it versus even a nonprofit. I'm thinking specifically of a race where you have runners running on streets and heaven forbid a car blow through a barricade and plow into runners. So every business and nonprofit is going to have their own definition of what they see as a potential crisis that could come upon their business. One thing I like to always stress is while yes, we are thinking about more of a violent scenario, let's not forget natural disasters. Let's not forget that tornado that hits in the middle of the day, the straight line winds that come and push down oak trees onto power lines and your business is without electricity for 4 or 5 days. How are you communicating on social media? Some of those natural disaster elements that we might not gravitate towards. So again, number one would be let's identify what some of those potential crises could be for that specific business. And then let's come up with the plan. And part of that plan is who's at the table? Is it your entire executive leadership? Is it key personnel from your executive leadership? Is it an HR director or a communications person who are not a part of executive leadership? Is it just one person? Is it a manager and a co-manager? Who's at the table? Who needs to be there when that crisis happens, making those decisions, making those calls in terms of this is how we are going to react. And then third and final, it would be after we've crafted that plan, let's rehearse it. Let's almost make that as a part of muscle memory. We can have a beautiful plan and know exactly who's on point, who is speaking, where people are going, and then we put it in a binder and stick it on the shelf. Well, that's not really going to help us in a crisis. And so, one of the things that I enjoy doing is working with businesses in running those drills and practicing for those moments so that when you are in that moment, it's second nature. You know exactly. This person's coming to this room, this person's coming to that room. Our command center is set up across the street. We are speaking with one voice. We know what our communication is going to sound like. We know what we're going to say. We have press release templates ready to be issued. Just kind of fill in the blank. We are going to give the press as much as we can in the moment so that they can do their job. And then we're going to give them more a few hours later once we've learned more. One of the parts about a crisis is, particularly when it comes in the media, is you want to minimize your time in that news cycle. Now, there are some crises where you're going to be in the news cycle for 48 hours, 72 hours. I'm thinking of one crisis in particular when there was the oil spill down in the Gulf, gosh, probably 15 years ago. And that stayed in the news cycle for many years to come.
The good
We
news today is the news cycle tends to move very quickly, and the next crisis is right around the corner in some.
That's right. It really is. If you hang on, somebody else is getting ready to have a crisis. And
Right.
so if you can position your company, your business, your online presence in such a way, we really try to mitigate just how long you are staying in that crisis.
I want to great advice. I want to add one thing to what you said because I think there, and I'm sure this is if you peel back a little further, there may be multiple constituencies. There may be our customer base, our external variable, but there's also the internal. You think about a natural disaster. How does it impact our employees? How do we have a storefront that's open and we have electricity and we're ready to sell, but our employees can't get across the bridge that's out to get to our store. So, it can be multifaceted in terms of who the audiences are. And I would think that, a crisis plan would also take into consideration who's the appropriate person to communicate that message.
That's right.
I think a lot of smaller businesses and even larger businesses, if you think about who ends up being the spokesperson, it's very often, that exec suite, that CEO or an owner, but they may not be the most effective communicator. And so perhaps sometimes it's a third party or somebody, as a spokesperson for the entity or somebody in a particularly executive role that may be better suited towards it. So it can take on, different stripes depending on the organization. So it's a very individualized thing from that perspective.
It very much is. And you briefly touched on, how do you communicate internally in the midst of a crisis? And depending on how large of a business, human resources, that department gets funneled in because now do you have employees that are out speaking to the media that really might not be that might not be qualified to be speaking to the media because as a former reporter, listen, anybody who wanted to talk to me, I got a microphone and I'm ready to put it and let you sing like a bird. And that isn't always appropriate or
I,
or
I
right.
was I was just going to say that, remembering that you were a former reporter, and that's music to your ears. Where you talk to us on camera, and great, we'll get whatever perspective, and then next thing you've got an internal crisis brewing because people are delivering either inaccurate information or not authorized to speak on behalf, and et cetera, et cetera. So, I think there's also an intersection between that crisis plan from a communications perspective, but also I think you touched on sort of an element that I would call business continuity. In the event of a crisis, how do we continue to operate? What are those elements that really mean crisis? There's a fire at a supplier's location, and it's going to slow down our purchase cycle or our ability to get raw materials. Is that a crisis on us, or is that a crisis that can be mitigated in some way? Can we take action to mitigate that? So really, the magnitude can vary dramatically, I guess, from, as you said, large natural disasters down to very individualized situations.
That's right. And you don't want to neglect your website in a crisis. You certainly don't want to neglect your social channels in a crisis, because oftentimes that's where the public is going to gravitate towards. Oh, what are they saying on their website, or what are they saying on LinkedIn or Instagram or what have you? And so those are other additional elements to be considered when you are putting this plan together. Is, well, not just how are we communicating effectively to our employees, to other stakeholders, to the community, but then everybody else on social media and other customers that we may do business with that aren't in our immediate community.
So fantastic advice, Michelle. Develop a plan, make sure it's documented, make sure everybody understands their roles, and as they say, practice makes perfect. Make sure you have it down, and your best practice around reviewing that plan. Should that be done on an annual basis as markets or situations change, as seasons change? If we're looking at natural disasters, all of the above.
I do like that. I typically would recommend to maybe take a look at it a couple times a year. Again, not only do seasons change, but your leadership may change, and there may be key players in a crisis situation who have left the organization, or for whatever reason just have moved on. And so then it's a question of, well, the person who stepped into perhaps a vacated role, is that still the right person to speak? Or do we need to find someone else that needs to have a seat at the table? But I think that it's very important to run those drills, so to speak, a couple times a year, maybe even once a quarter, where you are simulating that moment. And again, depending on how large of an organization, it may be something that you involve your local authorities in. I'm thinking of specifically an experience that I participated in where our city police and our sheriff's department not only knew that this company had a plan, but sent representatives from each department when we just kind of ran the plan as a tabletop exercise, so that the law enforcement had an idea of the inner workings of the company, so that as they might be responding to something, they already knew, okay, this company already has something in place, and we are now familiar with those individuals, and we know that they're the good guys, and kind of work through there. So there, it can certainly be expanded, but more on a smaller business entrepreneur level. Yeah, run those plans, go over them at least a couple times a year.
Fantastic. Great advice, Michelle. Michelle Rupp, founder and CEO of Memorable Results Media. If people want to get in touch with you, talk more about crisis planning, how to put one together, maybe get some assistance with it, what's the best way for them to reach you?
LinkedIn is a great location. I am Michelle Rupp at LinkedIn. And then the website, of course, is always a second great location, and that is memorableresultsmedia.com.
Fantastic. Our guest has been Michelle Rupp, founder and CEO of Memorable Results Media. It's been a pleasure having you again on Radio
Thanks,
Entrepreneurs.
Jonathan.
And we'll be right back with another segment on Radio Entrepreneurs.